Hello everyone, this is Revan, and I'm going to be talking about fundamentals and tactics. So this is going to be a discussion on a lot of the current strategy, as well as where stuff is potentially going to go. Because how most people approach strategy right now is a little bit, there's a problem with it, and I'll talk about that hopefully in this video. So how I define fundamentals is really based on a particular type of strategy. So I'm going to lead you through this list of things that I have written out for you. So primitive strategy is just going to be a very simple sort of strategy. No one really does it except very beginning players, but it's still instructive to look at. Elementary strategy, which is where a lot of people stand, and then fundamental strategy, which is a very natural sort of improvement on elementary strategy. But then I'm going to point out a problem with it, and then a potential solution. This might be confusing for some people, especially closer to the end. I'm going to try and go through it quick, because this could be a very long video if I don't. So I'm just going to get started here. Okay, so first off, what is a primitive strategy? So the first thing I'm going to mention is what a situation is. So we call, let me just make this brush a little bit thicker. A situation, say A, is just naturally what you think of it as, right? So a situation could be something like they're in front of me, or the opponent is one character length in front of me, right? I'm allowing the situations to be very vague at the moment. It could be from like the in-game position coordinates of where your opponent is and where you are. And it could be something very vague like they are below me or they are in front of me. I'm allowing it to be as vague as you want it to be. And an action, B, this is something you do in a situation. So it's not very, these are defined very loosely. So for example, B could be something like grab, or down smash, or move to side platform. And then now that I've defined these two things, there's a pretty obvious connection between these two, right? So I'm going to define an arrow as a situation paired with an action. So, for example, it could be something like the opponent is below me. Say I'm Mario. The opponent is below me and I'm in the air. I fast fall down air, right? That's a very natural example of a situation. Or they're in front of me, like less than a character length in front of me, so I grab them, right? This is a very natural sort of structure. So now that we have situations, arrows, or situations, actions, and arrows, I will also note, and this is pretty important for what we're going to talk about later, to every arrow you can associate, I'm going to write it as D, I guess. You can associate another action, another situation, which is going to be the resulting situation. So for example, if it's they're below me, I'm Mario, I fast fall down air, and then Z cancel it. The resulting situation D could be I am facing them right in front of them, and we're both grounded, right? So this is an action, this B, and these are situations. The resulting situation, and then the preceding situation. Okay, so that makes sense so far. Now for a primitive strategy, we don't actually care about this resulting situation D, because what a primitive strategy is just a collection of arrows. So for primitive strategy, I'm just going to write it like this, right? So if you were a player who was doing a primitive strategy, what you'd want to do, how you'd want to improve your primitive strategy, is memorize more of these arrows that are effective. So for example, if you were executing a primitive strategy and you only had one arrow, and that was, I'm Mario, say, if they're in front of me, I am going to down smash. And that's the only arrow you have. You'd essentially be standing all game, but the moment the opponent was in front of you, you would down smash. And how you'd improve is you'd learn different good things to do in different situations. So say they're above me, I up smash, right? And you learn several things like this. They're 5 character lengths away, I start walking forwards, right? The vagueness of both situations and actions allows us to do a lot with this. Okay, so a primitive strategy is just a collection of arrows, and the next sort of strategy is an elementary strategy. And this strategy actually does care about resulting situations, because the key difference between primitive strategy and elementary strategy is the introduction of chains. So an elementary strategy, the key idea is you have all of these arrows, right? So A1, when you're encountered with situation A1, you respond with B1, and then you have a resulting situation A2. But say you already have an arrow from A2 to B2, right? Then you can continue in this way for as long as you have these arrows, and you end up with this large block. I'll call it C, and this is a chain, right? So you can think of combos as chains. Those are very natural chains. Certain frame traps are chains. But even something like a method to gain stage position can be a chain. A chain is very general. It's a sequence of very obvious actions. And these chains are actually very valuable in and of themselves. Essentially, all of a sudden, when you have elementary strategy, it's very obvious how important these chains are. And you can measure the strength of the chains. Say it's a combo. You can measure it by percent. Say it's a way to get stage position. You can measure it by how much stage position you get, right? There are very easy ways to measure the strength of a chain, which I'm going to write this way. So let's introduce some new notation. If we have a chain, say A1 leads to, or sorry, in A1 you perform B2, you end up with A2, and this leads to, and this chain kind of goes on, and you eventually end up being led to this Bn, which results in this A. I'm just going to write it as A. Then we're going to write it, if we call this chain C, we're going to write A1 leads to Bn by C, and then the resulting situation is A. Okay? So, we're going to call a chain terminal if there are no arrows outside of this A, right? So if there's nothing that follows this, we say this chain is terminal. That's more semantics, don't worry too much about that. But this notation is kind of, for this strategy, a little bit silly, because we don't actually care where we end up here. The value is in the chain itself, because we've already established chains have a certain strength associated with them. We want to do chains. So I'm going to write this instead as A1 leads to C. Then all of a sudden, since C has a certain strength associated with it, we can measure the strength of a situation, here A1, as follows. A very obvious way to go about doing it would be you measure the strength of a situation A to just be the sum of all the terminal chains. So essentially, everything valuable that it can possibly lead to, right? So say you have many different combos you can do out of a certain situation, then it's a very good situation to be in. And this is sort of a natural way to measure situations. So all of a sudden, we can weigh different situations against each other. This is a really core sort of, we really have some meat to our strategy here, right? We know we can all of a sudden say, oh, this is a good situation for us. This is a bad situation for us, right? So this is an elementary strategy, and it actually has a pretty big problem that we didn't mention before, but we're going to mention it now because it's a key concept of fundamental strategy. So when we write A1 leads to B, sorry, yeah, A1 leads to B and it results in A2, because of how vague we allow A1 to be, this is not necessarily confirmed, right? If we're above them and we fast fall down air, we may or may not have connected. So this A2 could be completely different, right? So it's sort of strange, right? So we have a few ways to proceed. We can force this A1 to be very, very specific, which is called the specification method, or we can allow this to be very vague. Actually, first, let's just talk about the specification method. So that's a very natural way to proceed. Just force these things to be very specific, memorize more and more strategies. So this is very bad. This is a very bad strategy. And the reason is because in a game as fast as Smash, you need to preserve computation time. You need to preserve the space in your memory. Otherwise, because it's extremely valuable, right? So if you have every decision you make, if you make it very, very computationally intensive, it just doesn't work very well. You can't compute how good situations are fast enough. You can't even figure out what situation you're in fast enough. You're already out of that situation. So this is a very bad way to proceed, simply because it's too computationally intensive. And this will come up later. So instead of doing the specification method, we're going to do blanketing, which is we still allow this to be very vague, but instead we associate a probability with the arrow, right? Maybe I'll write it like this, right? Okay, so all of a sudden we have a sort of probability associated with every arrow, which again, it's a decent way to proceed. Maybe it's not so nice to work with probabilities, but as long as, right, because you don't want to compute these things, but you can be very loose with the definition of a probability. You can say it's confirmed, unconfirmed, probable, improbable, and that's okay to work with in game. You can figure out whether something's a good option or a bad option very quickly in this way. So let's keep going then. How do we? What does this fix? What does this change? Well, then all of a sudden, when we measure the strength of a situation, we're not going to measure it as before as the sum of the strengths of the terminal chains. We also have to multiply the strength of the terminal chains by the probability that the chain will occur. I'm just going to write this one like this because we don't care about the end state. So, sorry. So this is finally a very natural and very easy way to measure the strength of situations. Okay, so this is what I call a fundamental strategy. Why is this important? So, this is important because all of a sudden, if you're a player who wants to execute a fundamental strategy, what do you do? What do you have to do? Well, first of all, you have to memorize arrows, right? You have to learn what are good things to do in different situations, and as many of these as you can. What else do you have to do? Well, you have to memorize chains, right? Um, because chains have value. These are very important for elementary strategy, and so they're also very important for fundamental strategy, because fundamental strategy is based off of elementary strategy. And finally, you have to memorize the probabilities both of chains and the probabilities of arrows, which turn out to be the same in a certain sense. Like, you can figure this out from if you know all of these. So that's okay. We're at a point now where, as a player, we care about these three things. If we want to improve, if we want to get better at our strategy, we have to, or if we want to improve our strategy, we have to learn these things, right? Excuse me. So these are what I call fundamentals. They're things that a player who wants to execute a fundamental strategy has to work on, okay? So this is where most players are at right now, it feels like. They try and work on these things, and they try as much as possible to memorize this, right? They get really, really good at fundamentals, and that's how they're going to improve. Okay, now, here are some problems with fundamental strategy. You might not be surprised, but part of why I made this video is because fundamental strategy has been something that's been giving me some trouble recently. Because, note when we talked about the probability of something working in a given situation, or we wrote it like this. This depends, this is not well defined in general, right? Um, say I think if I'm above someone, I'm going to fast fall down air them. And then I'm going to connect and land behind them. The probability of that happening is not the same for against every player. Say a player is very eager to run away, well then the probability that'll land is very low. Say a player is very eager to up tilt, well then maybe it'll be a very high probability that it'll land, right? If you, or say someone expects you to fast fall, then it'll be a high probability. Where if someone expects you to slow fall, it'll again be a very low probability. So all of a sudden, these probabilities, you can't just define them. Sorry, you can't just memorize them, because they depend on your opponent, or the state of your opponent. And this is a very important idea, because again, we have two ways to proceed, or we only really have one way to proceed, because we tried blanketing the probabilities and it didn't work. So again, the thing that it seems to do would be to memorize these probabilities given a certain player, right? But again, this is computationally very, very slow. This is not a good way to proceed in as fast a game as Smash. It just takes up way too much space, way too much computation time. Memorizing it is infeasible because this isn't constant even during a game. There are a lot of bad decisions people can make here. And so all of a sudden it's very confusing. How do we proceed? We've concluded that thinking about probabilities isn't really a nice, isn't really a nice solution. Or like it works okay, but it's just not a very consistent sort of strategy, this fundamental strategy. So how do we deal with it? And my most recent idea, which probably isn't too shocking to most people, It's an idea that comes up a lot, but I don't think is as heavily emphasized as it is here. It's the development of tactical strategy. Tactical strategy is works from the same foundation as primitive strategy. In primitive strategy, you have you're in situation A, you perform action B, then you have a resulting situation D, right? So for tactical strategy, we have similar ideas where we have arrows, and these are nice structures to work with, so we want to stay with that. But the arrows are in different spots. They move, they point from different things to different things. So if Z is a player state, which is, say, you can think of it as a habit. It's not quite a habit, but a habit is an example of a player state. You can draw an arrow to B, which is essentially a way to punish that habit or a response to the player state. And then Z prime, or maybe I'll write it as X, which is the resulting player state. And proceeding to do strategy this way, it's okay. It seems to work fine. Though you'll notice, if you just try and think about this way, you might notice some immediate problems. Like, okay, well, I know their beginning. First of all, figuring out the beginning state is hard in and of itself. But say we know that, well, then how do we figure out the resulting player state? And that's pretty tricky, how you do that, right? Because figuring out resulting situations was already kind of difficult with primitive strategy because we had to associate probabilities to it and stuff. But let's just ignore that for now. Say we can figure out what the resulting player state is and everything. There are other problems that crop up, like how do you know what's confirmed? How specific can this get? Again, we're allowing it to be very vague. And this isn't sort of the perfect solution. This is a primitive tactical strategy. It is as bad as a primitive strategy. Maybe slightly better, but you can't expect too much of it. Where this is really going to become strong is when you get elementary tactical strategies, which is where you introduce chains of tactics, or sorry, chains of these arrows. So say someone's in a player state Z1, you respond with B1, and then they have a resulting player state Z2, and then you respond to the player state Z2 with B2, and you continue in this way, and then you end up with a tactical chain, C. And then you can compare player states all of a sudden, right? And then instead of doing what you did before where you want to move to, you figure out what situations are good for you and which situations are bad for you, you figure out what player states are good for you, so you try and move your opponent into that player state. You figure out what player states are bad for you, so you try and keep your opponent away from those player states. And it sort of generalizes from the previous situation. It might be somewhat difficult to wrap your head around it, because it's a little bit abstract, but it's fine and it's consistent, and it actually is a decent generalization of just fundamentals. Um, Now, this idea on its own, this sort of theory crafting, it's not too valuable in and of itself, right? Because, well, how do we know? How can we construct these sort of tactical chains? How do I actually figure out something like this? And that's sort of like a challenge that you have to figure out on your own. I'm currently working on it, and I've figured a few out, and I'm quite excited about it, but I'll certainly have to figure out a lot more before I'm even competent with this sort of strategy. Um, and then moving up from this and associating, like, are we going to proceed in the same way after this? Once we get an elementary tactical strategy, are we going to come up with just a straight tactical strategy where we introduce the probability again, get some blanketing going, and then I'm not sure if that would even be a good idea or not, but I'm sure it's inevitably going to happen. And this seems like the best way to proceed, at least in the current meta, because if it feels like if you stick to a fundamental strategy, you're just going to be edged out. There's no way. If you want to get better than someone, you're going to have to come up with something that they don't that they aren't doing, right? You can't just get better than them at what they're already doing. It's sort of silly. So this tactical strategy, it seems pretty good. If you've understood it, then I'd encourage you to sort of try and figure some tactics, or sorry, figure out some arrows, figure out some chains, um, and then sort of, yeah, figure out like a full on elementary tactical strategy, and maybe even just a straight tactical strategy if you can figure it out. And then once we have a fundamental, or rather a tactical strategy, we can define what tactics are. Note, tactics aren't yet defined because we don't have a tactical strategy defined. Okay, cool. So I could ramble about this forever. I think I've gone quite a while here. Uh, hopefully this doesn't come off too much as crazy ramblings, and it actually makes sense to someone, and someone can get something out of it. If nothing else, I think the talk about fundamentals is important, as well as the big error in fundamental strategy, which everyone does. Like basically everyone, even like top level players right now. They just have really good fundamentals and then they do fundamental strategy. They might do stuff like baiting and stuff, or like reading, right? Which is a key part of tactics, but they do it at like such a small scale or with so little structure. Like you don't see anyone chaining reads, right? That just seems ridiculous. How do you chain reads? But like you chain sillier things than reads, right? Anyway, yeah. So that's sort of my current idea I'm playing around with, trying to figure it out. It's not easy, but I think it could, if I get decently good at this, I think it could have a reasonably big impact on my play. And it could have a reasonably big impact on the meta if a lot of other people get really, really good with this style of play, this type of strategy. So I've done plenty of rambling, I think. So yeah, see you guys around.